एयरपोर्ट एयरपोर्ट यूज़ कर रहा था अभी।
How do we do that? So let's say we will go for a normal class here. So let's say we have a class A, and then we got a class B. So basically, I'm trying to go for method overriding here. So of course, we have to extend a class, and then this will have a method which is show, and then in this show, I'm printing, let's say, in.
अरे नहीं, बहुत दिन से
We got a class B. So basically,
प्लेलिस्ट वाली खत्म हो गई, एडवांस जावा वाली कर रहा हूँ, आज ही रह गई। यार मैं लिखता जा रहा हूँ, मुझे लग रहा है बस। जब ज्यादा बड़ा तो जब साथ वाले का हो जा रहा है नहीं तो कोशिश करी तो मेहनत करना जब साथ वाले का होता है तो ज्यादा है। जो बता रहा था हाँ, भाई बता मुझे पता है मेरा नाम लेने वाला होगा इस पर हम तो देख ये तो कुड़ के मर गया था, जल गया था ये।
now once we know about inner class,
ऐसा ही है क्या पाजी? ऐसा ही है क्या? आदमी जल के मर जाए। क्या लिखी बात? जब इस बात की होना क्या हो गया? आज अरे यार तेरा तो उसमें भी एडो दिया तूने? दिया नहीं था? अरे तुम्हारी टीम में क्यों नहीं आया? दो क्वेश्चन मैं तो छुए भी नहीं थे। आगे नहीं बात। हाँ कोहली तो थी यार। ये बैन कर दी। अबे आवाज खुली यार तू, म्यूट करना पड़ा।
so let's expand our example. example of enum with if else and switch. Now, as I mentioned before, these are constants, right? So basically, when you have this constant, can we just compare them? We can actually, the way you compare normal variables or strings. So let's take an example here. Let me just remove int variable there, and let me also remove the array. Let's keep it simple now. So let's say I have a status here, and s is equal to. The moment you mention a parameterized constructor, it says, hey, if you want to get a constant, you need to set the price now because you have a parameterized constructor. There's no default. Make your work. In this video, let's talk about enums. Now, enums are named constants which we create. So basically, if you try to have some constant example, when we talk about error codes, or if you have worked on a networking concept, so let's say when you send a request to the server will give you some status, right? If it is accepted the request, if it is rejected the request, or the resource not found, the 404 error. So basically, we have these numbers for every type of data you get from the server. And also we can have a name for it. Now, when you know that we have a specific error codes, or when you have a specific constant which you want to use, instead of creating a different object by yourself, you can create enum. Now, how it looks like, let me just give you a simple example. So let's say we have enum
क्या
in a show.
हाँ यार ये बंद कर देना
In this video, let's talk about annotations. Now, annotation simply means a supplement to the compiler or to the runtime, or we also call it as a metadata. So basically what happens, when you write a code, sometimes you want to interact with a compiler by saying something. Of course, it will not change the way your code will work. It's just that we want to supply some extra information to the compiler or to the runtime. How do we do that? So let's say we will go for a normal class here. So let's say we have a class A, and then we'll go for compiler is to the compiler or to the runtime, or we also call it as a metadata. So basically what happens, when you write a code, some annotation simply means a supplement. In this video, let's talk about annotations. Now, annotation simply means a supplement to the compiler or to the runtime, or we also call it as a metadata. So basically what happens, when you write a code, or annotation simply means a supplement to the compiler or to the runtime, or we also call it as a metadata. So basically what happens, when you write a code, sometimes you want to interact with a compiler by saying what or to the runtime, or we also call it as a metadata. So basically or to the annotations. Now, annotation simply means a supplement to the compiler or to the runtime, or we also call it as a metadata. So basically what happens, when you write a code, or annotation simply means a supplement to the compiler or to the runtime, or we also call it as a metadata. So basically what happens, when you write a code, sometimes you want to interact with a compiler by saying something. Of course, it will not change the way your also call it as a metadata. So basically what happens, when you write a code, sometimes you want to interact with a compiler by saying something. Of course, it will not change the way your code will work. It's just that we want to supply some extra information to the compiler or to the runtime. How do we do that? So let's say we will go for a normal class here. So let's say we have a class A, and then we got a class B. So basically I'm trying to go for a method overriding here. So of course we have to extend a class, and then this will have a method which is show. And then in this show, I'm printing, let's say, in a show. And the same thing I can do in B as well. The only thing is we have to change it here. Now, what we are doing here is we are overriding the show method of A with the show method of B. And then we have seen this before, right? Okay, let's create the object of B just to understand this. I will say B obj equal to new B. And then I can call obj.show. And we all know what will be the output. So if I compile this code and run, you can see it says in B show. Perfect. Now, let's say I change this method name. Okay, not show, but something else. I will say show the data which belongs to this class. Okay, so normally in Java, we give a meaningful name to a method, right? And sometimes your method name can be big. And yes, okay, I know this is exaggerated, but sometimes you do have a big method names with 2 or 3 words or 4 words. And then of course, if you want to override this particular method, we have to type the same thing here. So I will say the data which belongs to this class. Okay, so again, I'm just trying to override the method of A class with the method of B class, right? And of course, we have to call this now. So I will just try to get it from the suggestion. Okay, so if you can see, I'm just trying to call this method. And what do you think? What will be the output? Of course, we have overridden the method, so it should call in B show, right? So if I compile this code and if I run this code, oh, it is printing in A show. Now we were expecting in B show. In fact, I wanted in B show, but we got in A show. Now this type of problems in programming is called bugs. Okay, bugs are simply logical problems where you are expecting something else and you got something else. Example, you want to say 2 plus 2 and the output is 4, but you got 5. That is logical problem. It's not a compile time issue. It's not a runtime issue. It's the logical. It's the logic which you have written is wrong. And one of the most difficult problems to solve is logical problems. You know, we always say in programming that, you spend less time in coding and more time in debugging. That's what is happening here. So, of course, you have only 2 classes here and it is easy to debug. But if you have a lot of classes, it will be very difficult. Now, how do you debug? Of course, we are trying to call the method of B class, but we got the method of A class, right? How will you solve this problem? So let's try to understand the method name. On purpose, I changed the method names, okay? I know in this method, I don't have it. Calling the method of A. You can show your error. And looking at the error, we can easily understand, hey, I did something wrong, and let's go back and solve this. So what if you can ask your compiler, hey compiler, you know what I'm doing here? I'm trying to override the method here of class A, and if it's not happening, let me know. So you can show your intention, and you can show the intention with the help of annotation. There are a lot of inbuilt annotations available in Java. One of them is override. So you can simply use @ here, and you can say override. Now you are saying by doing this to your compiler, hey, I'm trying to override the method. And your compiler says, you know what? There's no method called show the data which belongs to this class in the A class. And then you will know, oh, I made a mistake. And then you can solve this problem just by putting S. Of course, you can compare these two methods and you can say, I got the problem. So of course, you have to solve the problem. So compiler is helping you by showing the problem, right? At least you got some help. And solving the problem at compile time is much better than solving the problem at runtime or when you deploy the application to the users. And then users will give you a prompt, hey, you made a mistake. So let's avoid that embarrassment and let's solve the problem at compile time. So at override is one of the way you can do that. And now if you try to compile and run, you will get in B show. Now, apart from this override, we have different annotations as well, which we normally use. In terms of Core Java, we don't use most of the annotations. Of course, you can create your own annotations, but in general, we don't use much. Now, once you start working with the frameworks, example, when you talk about Hibernate framework or Spring framework, at that point, it is mostly driven by the annotations. Now, there are some annotations which works on the methods. There are some annotations which works on variables. There are some annotations which works on class level. So, example, I'm trying to go for method overriding here. So, of course, we will have a method which is show, and then in this show, I'm printing, let's say, in